Welcome back to Yahoo Finance. It was Spider-Man continuing to dominate the box office despite the emergence of some other contenders this week, like The Matrix. Don't tell Adam about that. But let's bring in Shawn Robbins, box office pro chief analyst, and Yahoo Finance's Canal for a conversation on the box office numbers. Again, second weekend here for Spider-Man, which raked in over $1 billion worldwide. And Shawn, pretty significant, given that it was an Omicron variant that had some people with No Way Home after getting infected, but still numbers that are very comparable to Avengers Endgame now.
Yeah, this is really the type of movie that Hollywood has been waiting for, movie theaters have been waiting for, especially over the past 2 years. This is the biggest global hit since Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker before the pandemic. And to achieve these kinds of numbers without a Chinese release is particularly notable, in my opinion. I think this really speaks to what we can start to see from the long-term recovery, but it also tells us a lot from what we've seen this year in terms of who is and who isn't coming back to theaters right now.
Shawn, Spider-Man, obviously a huge success, but I want to touch on some of the films that didn't do so well. We had The Matrix, West Side Story. These were big, buzzy films that underperformed in theaters. What's your take on those dismal performances, and what do you think that says about the box office consumer right now?
You know, it was a very mixed weekend of results. We saw Spider-Man and Sync 2 do fairly well, but The Matrix had a lot going in against it. I think it had two sequels that were nearly 20 years old that really didn't end the franchise on a high note, so to speak. The streaming release also has cannibalized, I think, viewership in theaters, which we've seen with a number of other Warner Brothers movies this year. West Side Story, honestly, is a victim of its timing and its audience more than anything else. Despite strong reviews in Steven Spielberg, it catered mostly to musical fans, which tend to be women over the age of 35. And statistically, that's the audience we've seen most hesitant to come back to theaters this year.
As you mentioned, The Matrix was a hybrid release on HBO Max. Throughout 2021, we saw this theme of theatrical only versus day and date releases. What's your take on that experiment and how that played out this year? And how do you view streaming as a competitor to the box office heading into 2022?
Well, it's a big subject and it's hard to really narrow down. But I think, number one, we're seeing the shift back to a strategy of theatrical first for most studios in 2022 speaks volumes. Warner Brothers itself will be going back to a 45-day model for most of its biggest titles after The Matrix. This is effectively the last in an experiment for now. But we've also seen statistically, again, I hate to point back to that word again, but the most frequent consumers of streaming also tend to be the most frequent moviegoers. It really comes down to whoever's watching the content wants to see it where it's available. I think ultimately these are two very different forms of experiencing media in general, and they can coexist together.
Shawn, I've been ragging on Matrix 4 Resurrections throughout the whole show. Honestly, though, I thought Doogie Howser as the creepy guy was pretty cool, and the effects are great. If I were a 15 or 16-year-old gal or guy, I think this was the greatest film ever. I'm not. So going forward, who is the audience? Because we keep hearing how things are changing when, in fact, they really aren't, are they? I mean, Spider-Man, I got to imagine the audience, as terrific as a movie as it is, it's geared for the under 25 crowd. And isn't that where the future is, whether it's in the theater or streaming?
Right. And that's really, very counter to what we've heard discussed before the pandemic, because what the movie theater was becoming an aged audience. And now we're seeing the exact opposite of that being the case. Spider-Man has drawn strongly from under 25, and 25 to 34 is also almost an equally strong demo for it. It appeals to families. It's what we call a 4-quadrant movie. That's going to be the driver of the business, just like it used to be, but especially during the pandemic, it's even more so. Theaters and studios are really reliant on that crowd showing up, and they've shown an eagerness to do so with movies like this.
And sticking with the theme here, I also want to talk about Don't Look Up, that debuted on Netflix. It's the #1 trending piece of content on the platform right now in the US. We're going to get those figures tomorrow when they release their top 10 numbers. But when you look at that movie, Netflix paid Leonardo DiCaprio $30 million to star in it. Moving forward, they shelled out nearly $500 million to secure the next 2 Knives Out sequels. So is this what we're going to see as the box office becomes more selective? Will we see these high cost films, these A-list films appear as streaming exclusives?
I think we'll see a bit of both. In some cases, a lot of these, I believe, really were greenlit into production early in the pandemic because it seemed like that's the short-term answer. And a lot of these movies, especially adult-driven movies, which we've seen play out, have, again, adult-driven movies have been the slowest to recover at the box office. I think we will see more of those go to streaming now and in the future, but I still think we'll see the high profile theatrical releases come out there, especially as we eventually get on the other side of the pandemic. That's really the unpredictable part to all of this with regard to how studios plan their release slates and how they move movies into production. They have to keep this business going. And if streaming is going to be the most reliable way of distribution in some cases, they're going to opt for that. But I think already we're seeing this year, the award season candidates in particular are going to theaters far more often than they were 12 months ago. So it's hard to say where we'll be at another 12 months from now.
And Shawn, just kind of the baseline here from a numbers standpoint, how difficult is it to compare apples to oranges for movies like The Matrix that are in theaters, but then also streamed online? Is a ticket at the physical theater worth as much as a stream online where you can honestly just bail through the movie halfway through, like I guess Adam regrets not doing? How do you measure those things?
That's the hard part of this because we don't have very much insight into streaming numbers. And even what we do see, it's not remotely comparable to, as you mentioned, a ticket sale, going to the box office, going to the movie theater, sitting down and watching the movie. So in terms of how these movies are profiting or not profiting, the water is very muddy right there. And especially with something like The Matrix Resurrections, which opened below expectations, which were already conservative because of the factors we talked about. You compare it to something like Dune, which has made over $100 million domestically. Godzilla versus Kong did that earlier this year. These movies are considered to have been relatively successful and profitable at the global box office. The Matrix Resurrections is a little bit more of a challenging position, but it's, again, there's an asterisk next to it because of the streaming component.
I'm glad you mentioned Dune because I thought that was amazing. I can't wait for part two. Because the first Dune, that movie from the 80s should stay buried in the 80s. As far as movies going forward, I realize the North American audience for years has been the predominant audience, but the theaters can't ignore the movie makers, rather, Asia. And so are we going to see storylines shift to what is culturally more dollar winning or money winning in Asia than what has worked in North America?
I think it's a trend we've started to see pop up and one I expect to continue. China in particular was really prevalent in a number of Marvel movies and Transformers movies in recent years. That market is in a very different situation now, box office and theatrical wise, than it was before the pandemic. That's an entirely different subject, but it is essentially the macrocosm of, I think, what speaks to in terms of studios pushing their content for a global audience.
And lastly here, Shawn, you did mention awards. We have the Golden Globes coming up, but how important is award season anymore?
I think it still holds a very important place in film culture. It certainly gets people jobs and recognition within the industry that can push them to the next level or get them other gigs down the road. You look at someone like Ryan Coogler, who directed Fruitvale Station and went on to do Black Panther. I think examples like that really kind of feed into how important it is to that side of the industry in terms of what it means to the populace and mainstream. It's certainly evolving, especially as we go year by year, and it's mostly films of a less than commercial nature that tend to win these awards. That's often been the case, though. I think that's a debate that will exist forever.
All right, we'll see. I mean, that all-star lineup in Don't Look Up seems like it's fishing for some Hollywood awards, but of course, I'll watch it just because Ariana Grande is in it. But Shawn Robbins, box office pro chief analyst, and Yahoo Finance's Ali Canal, thanks so much for that conversation.